Will the war in Ukraine turn into a nuclear war? Hello everyone. Today I'll be looking at the possibility of nuclear weapons being used in this war. I don't think it's very likely, and here's why. In general, we can talk about nuclear weapons in terms of tactical and strategic uses. Although this is somewhat oversimplified, tactical means striking military targets, strategic means destroying cities. And of course, there are always military targets within cities, so the lines get pretty blurry. It's also a bit of an artificial division, because even the small nuclear warheads are still measured in kilotons, or thousands of tons of TNT, and the target area is usually measured in kilometers rather than meters. To put this in perspective, the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki would be considered tactical nuclear weapons by today's standards. The main idea of tactical use is to attack enemy force concentrations and disrupt their deployment. The problem with this is that on the modern battlefield, the lethality of combat forces is such that concentrations are very low. One nuclear weapon, or even a few, is unlikely to be effective in disrupting a substantial enough part of the enemy force to justify the use. The implication here is that the tactical use of nuclear weapons is no longer a very valuable military capability, and I'm sure the Russians know that too. So what about strategic use of nuclear weapons? Well, beyond the obvious moral prescription against doing so, which has a fairly high level of international support, I don't think the Russians subscribe to the American interpretation of how the Second World War was ended in the Pacific. Russians probably discount the use of nuclear weapons and consider the Soviet entry into the war against Japan as the basis for surrender. I doubt they believe Ukraine would surrender because of a strategic nuclear strike. Furthermore, such an escalation, something that has not happened since 1945, would have unknown, though probably serious consequences resulting from the reaction of NATO and possibly even China and India as well. The risks seem incredibly high unless the fundamental survival of Russia was at stake, and even then, losing in Ukraine certainly does not constitute such a threat. So what about if Russia wins? Peter Zeihan, a geopolitical analyst, has recently claimed to quote, "If Russians win in Ukraine, we will have a nuclear exchange." His reasoning is based on the geography of Europe. For Russia to be secure, according to his argument, it would have to control parts of Poland and Romania, and therefore he believes Russia intends to advance beyond Ukraine if it wins. However, since its conventional forces have performed so poorly, Russia's only option will be to intimidate the West through the use of nuclear weapons, possibly by targeting one or more European cities. While there are Russian officials who have spoken about advancing into Poland, as well as lots of talk of using nuclear weapons, such statements do not appear to reflect Russia's war aims. Zeihan often provides fascinating analysis, but I think he's wrong about Russian intentions in this case. I think you can argue that since the end of the Second World War, political resistance to the use of nuclear weapons has steadily grown. There are several examples of nuclear-armed states losing wars against non-nuclear states. In such limited wars, consideration of using nuclear weapons seems to have evolved from being an extreme option, like in the Korean War, to being more or less unthinkable by the time of the war in Afghanistan. For now, Russia is only at war with Ukraine, and this remains a strictly limited war. Despite all the talk about NATO engagement, there is no Russian war with NATO, just like there was no Soviet war with the Americans in Vietnam, even though the USSR provided massive military aid to the North Vietnamese, up to and including tanks, anti-aircraft batteries, and fighters. For all the vaguely worded threats that have been uttered, the use of nuclear weapons in this war remains somewhat unspeakable. And is also some reason to believe that even if NATO was directly involved in the war against Russia, there would continue to be some degree of resistance to using nuclear weapons on both sides. Here, I would point to the little-known Kargil War of 1999, fought by India and Pakistan. Both countries were armed with nuclear weapons, but neither side used them, even though the war lasted for almost 3 months and about 1,000 troops died in the intense fighting. Ultimately, Pakistan was defeated on the battlefield, and it returned to the status quo rather than escalate. My claim that such resistance to using a weapon of mass destruction exists also has a historical antecedent: the non-use of chemical weapons in World War II. Prior to the outbreak of war, no one discounted the use of chemical weapons. Germany had even developed nerve gas agents by the time the war had begun. Just imagine the casualties that might have resulted from using nerve gas during the bombing of Warsaw, Rotterdam, or the London Blitz. Everyone had stocks, and yet no one ever used them. France didn't use them in the desperate days of May 1940. The Soviets didn't use them even when Moscow was threatened in 1941. And the Germans didn't use them in the hopeless last months of the war in Europe. It is arguable that a thorough understanding of the effects of nuclear weapons, something that was only achieved in the mid-1980s, has developed resistance to use similar to that demonstrated in World War II regarding chemical weapons. I'd like to believe this discussion provides some reassurance to those of you who are worried about a nuclear war breaking out. But I think it is important to note that nuclear weapons do exist, and so there is a non-zero probability they will be used at some point in time. Nobody knows what that probability happens to be. It might be comparable to the odds of an asteroid striking Earth this year and wiping out life on this planet. Or it might be the chances of you being in a car accident this year. Both are non-zero probabilities, but the odds of the asteroid are a lot lower than that of the car accident. Strangely enough, people are more likely to think and worry about the asteroid than the car accident. Maybe that's true of nuclear use as well, or maybe not. Like I said, nobody knows. Anyway, that's all I wanted to cover today. Let me know what you think in the comments. Like and subscribe if you're so inclined. And regardless, thanks for watching all the way to the end.